Hello, we are the Edufuturists. I'm Dan Fitzpatrick.
I'm Ben Whitaker.
And I'm Stephen Heppell.
The podcast by educators for educators, the Edufuturist podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Edufuturist podcast. We again are recording this one live. You may have noticed just below me there is Professor Stephen Heppell. We're going to get Professor Stephen in just a sec. Yeah, we're recording live again. It's the second time we've done this. Thank you to everybody who is joining us for this. It's great to have you here. Don't forget, you can ask your questions, leave your comments. So if you're watching this on YouTube, there is the live chat, so put that on there. You can also reply to the tweet with the live stream on Twitter, and we'll see your comments. And what we'll do is we'll be looking through them during the show, and we'll put them to Professor Stephen, or we'll reply, we'll put them on the screen and showcase all the interaction that's going on out there.
Yeah, so we're excited to be joined by the world-renowned learning expert, Professor Stephen Heppell. We're also joined live tomorrow by Lord Jim Knight, a little bit later time of 6:30, and then on Friday by David Price, OBE at 2 p.m.
Why not? If you once you've listened to this, obviously don't go out now, but once you've listened to this one, check out our live broadcast that we did with Bob Harrison. We explored the future of EdTech and loads of interesting conversations about horse manure. I'm sure that if you haven't listened to that, you'll find that interesting. We've got over 140 podcast episodes in the back catalogue at edufuturist.com. And you can subscribe with your podcast app if you want to. And if you subscribe to our YouTube channel, you'll get a notification every time we go live. So please do that. Last little plug before we get into talking with our guest. Edufuturist.com/transform. We are doing a new learning, transforming online learning series that we've done some work with BenQ and some others. So please go and have a look check out that webpage if you can.
Yeah, so as we've said, today we are joined by Professor Stephen Heppell. We're really excited about this one. Stephen's portfolio of effective large-scale projects over the last 3 decades have established him internationally as a leader in the fields of learning, new media, and technology.
A school teacher for more than a decade and a professor since 1989. You don't look old enough, Stephen, just saying. Stephen has worked and is working with learner-led projects, governments around the world, international agencies, Fortune 500 companies, schools, communities, PhD students, the whole lot. He's been awarded the Royal Television Society's Judges Award for Lifelong Services for Educational Broadcasting, a prestigious BETT Award for Outstanding Achievement in ICT Education, and the UK's NAACE Award for Lifetime Achievement in Educational Technology.
Microsoft have described him as Europe's leading online education expert, and Bournemouth University stated that Professor Stephen Heppell is a world expert on contemporary learning, specialising in online education and learning spaces. As I like to say, we could talk about Stephen's credentials all night long. It's usually at the end of the podcast. Cheers for that, guys. I should read through the intros before we go, shouldn't I? But we've included more of a description below in the YouTube script below in the description. And you can also follow Professor Stephen on Twitter at Stephen Heppell.
The podcast by educators for educators, the Edufuturist podcast.
Professor Stephen Heppell, it's great to have you on. How are you coping with lockdown?
Oh, pretty well, really. And yeah, thanks for inviting me on. Hello to everybody watching this. It feels like a big old connected family, all the more so now we're all locked in the basement. I live out on the east coast of England, so we've got a bit of room around the house and a bit of a garden. I live with my 6-year-old and 4-year-old granddaughters, so it's been nice to have a lot of time with them, really. Although, and I've got noise-reducing earphones on, so there are moments when I'm grateful for them too. But yeah, we're getting by.
Brilliant. Thanks for joining us. It's great that you can be with us, and especially during this time of school closure and a lot of changes in education over the last few weeks. I think you're going to be an invaluable guest in the next hour or two, and it's just going to be great to pick your brains, because some of those projects that you've been involved with over the last 30 years have kind of led the way, really. So it's going to be great to get into them. So you've been a professor for 31 years, led some hugely significant projects. We want to go deep into some of these projects and explore your views on where education goes next after the coronavirus. And we were emailing each other before this to kind of get some ideas down, and you used a phrase which I really liked, and I actually put it as the title of this podcast now, The New Tomorrow. Could we maybe start off there and see where we go?
Yeah, let's. I mean, I'm lucky enough, really, over a long career, to have pretty much been right most of the time. In fact, all the time, actually, I think. But actually, the bit I'm never had a clue about is the timing. So, it was pretty damn obvious when we put mobile phones in the hand of children all those years ago, and the little girl said, "Hey, I can phone up somebody in France and practice my French." It was pretty obvious that was a significant technology, but it's taken 20 years. On the other hand, multimedia came and exploded in probably 2 or 3 years. We were making CD-ROMs, all those years ago, and I was getting abusive phone calls from people in publishing. I think we had one from the Encyclopedia Britannica. They phoned up and they were shouting down the phone at me, that there was so much information on a CD-ROM that if you didn't sell the CD for at least £700, you were kind of robbing the market. And I was saying, they're going to give them away in magazines. They're going to be free. This bloke was ranting. I was
at least their staff wouldn't have been as challenging, lugging all the books around to sell at doorsteps as well. It's easier to carry a CD in it. So,
well, what's interesting about this, of course, when we do get to these moments, which where there's a junction in the road and a lot of people go off down the new path. Not everybody. I was taught by people, all those years ago, and a few of them didn't have a television set in the house and were proud of that. So not everybody has to go leaping off in the same direction, but people have kind of nailed their colours to a mast. They take a long time to change, and a good example really would be, in health. Wasn't so long ago really that people they would bleed you to make you healthy. If Boris had gone off into hospital a few years, a century or so back, they just started bleeding him, and the KPI for bleeding was not whether you lived or not, it was how many times you were bled before you died. So they had these amazing charts of all the places you could, you'd start making bleeding people from the groin, which is like, I really don't want that going on, thank you very much. But that was supposed to be good for your humours or whatever. And of course, when better medicine came along and hygiene, those people kept on bleeding. The barber's pole, most of the places the men get their hair cut, there's a barber's pole outside, red and white. That represents the bandages and the bleeding, because it was the barbers that were doing the bleeding, because they had sharp knives. And even when hospitals were thriving, and they were still bleeding people. So, when change comes along, there's always those bleeders still lurking in the background, who aren't going to change. But I think we're at a moment when so many of the things we knew before, and had researched before, and had evidence before, suddenly have come to fruition, and it's very hard to put the genie back in the bottle at that point. I mean, at the simple level, it's just people don't enjoy commuting. In Madrid, I'm a professor in UCJC in Madrid. People commute for flipping hours in Madrid in the temperatures, and the traffic's appalling. They've all learned that they can work pretty effectively from home. And of course they're still learning how to do that well. But it's a damn sight better than commuting. Now, they're not going to go back to driving all those hours to sit in an office when they can work from home. Well, the minute that happens, you realise that there's an implication for education, because people send their kids to school so that they can go to work. And a few don't. Home educators give up their job to look after their children. That's fearfully expensive, because you give up a whole income for one child. So it's usually a very middle class thing. But, if you're working from home, then why wouldn't the kids be working from home with you and learning from home, and then all those problems of, do I drop off the children at school, and oh God, I've got a meeting, it's going on a bit late, and the kids are sitting on a phone, on a post box outside the school waiting for you to arrive. All those problems disappear because the kids are learning where you're working, So for a significant proportion of the population, the home will become a workplace and a learning place. And immediately that's a change, whether teachers wanted the change or not. And I'm a huge fan of teachers. I mean, I think the ingenuity people have brought to bear in the last fortnight has been jaw-dropping, absolutely jaw-dropping. And the humour, learning isn't about fun, although but sometimes it's nice to have fun when you're learning. It's not necessarily a cognitive process, but it sure as hell is a social process. I mean, if you're looking at those soft cognitive processes about empathy and so on, then humour surely is a part of all that, So yeah, it's interesting times. Or to take another simple example, really, I think the schools that have tried to let's recreate our lessons online. It's 11 o'clock, so sit down and we're going to have a RE with Reverend Smith, whatever. I mean, that's not quite as compelling as you might have hoped. But, I think we knew from the 80s, and I'll come to this in a minute, we were doing online learning in the 80s. What we learned, of course, was that, you create tasks and you stagger the tasks a bit. So you say to the kids, here are some things we'd like you to do every day. Practice your cursive writing, do some maths or whatever. And here are some things we'd like you to do by the end of the week. And by the way, here's a quite interesting project you might keep coming back to over the month. And rather than being a massive synchronous staggered activity, you have asynchronous activity with little moments of plenary coming together. And of course, if you look in some of our larger, more agile learning spaces, you'll find that's very much what happens. The kids all come together, sit on the tiered seating. Direct instruction still matters, for goodness sake, but you don't want to do it all day. So you kind of direct instruct the kids, tell them what they need to know. They go off into a zone classroom. The zones help them to model the behaviours you're looking for. And blow me down, that's what works online as well. And I think one of the things I've learned over all those years, 31 years seems like a long time, but I'm planning to live forever, and it's going okay at the moment. So there's a few more years coming. But one of the things we've learned is that typically what happens online appears physically about 10 years later. That's a fairly accurate. It doesn't matter how much better the technology gets. That's a people thing. So if people are suddenly starting to learn online in mixed age groups, and they're mentoring each other, and the young children are finding that it's fun to try and chase after the role model of the older kids, and the older kids find it's quite good for their understanding to have to reintroduce concepts to younger children. If that's happening online, whether it's in Mario Karts or whatever, if it's happening online, it will happen physically roughly a decade later.
That's really interesting, that, because I think we spent a lot of time looking at how are people using technology to continue learning. But you've really made me think there about how when we go back, how is what we've learned from online learning going to come back into the physical? I like that. Like almost relay back on to the physical classroom, and how is that going to look? And as you were speaking, I was really reminded of a guest we had on the podcast, Rob Hoban, who is the manager at the Agora School in Roermond in the Netherlands, and that's in what the way you're talking is how they do school. So they'll I don't know if you've come across them, but they have those projects that they're working on in the long term. They have their short term goals as well. They meet with a bit of like a team leader and advisor in the morning. They go off and work on their projects, and that whole physical realm of school is very different to what we would see, almost the Victorian 30 kids in a classroom, person at the front of the lectern style teaching.
Yes, I mean, people talk about the industrial classroom. I don't think I buy that. I think it's a very sociable place, and teachers are very adept at building relationships, and relationship and community are incredibly strong features of most schools. Not quite all schools, but most and many. And kids remember after their school days are long past. They remember the moments of camaraderie and mutuality and celebration, and of course. And by the way, I mean, back in the 1990s, we did a lot of surveying of people about their best learning experience. Now, it's like caveat, that was just their judgment of their best learning experience. We weren't in those days looking at outcomes. But I mean, the list they had, we just built a sort of taxonomy of their top items. About 2,000 people, not a bad survey size. And the top 10 things were obviously sort of constructivist learning, really. I mean, they were learning with others. They found that motivating. There was some, what the literature, I think, calls ipsative referencing. There was some sense of your own progress. They weren't much motivated by oh, look, I'm halfway up the bell curve or whatever. They said, you know what, I've done that and it was hard and I can do it now. The sort of thing that some of you will have celebrated when you learned to ride a bike or became fluent in a modern language or whatever. That sort of ipsative referencing was powerful. There was almost always an adult, a teacher, sometimes a coach or a parent present. What you were doing was hard. Nobody ever remembered their best learning moment doing something easy. So this was, deep learning, deep understanding, not just absorbing stuff. But most interestingly of all, they talked about their teachers and said, what the adult that was leading me, and of course they weren't, by leading, they were sort of saying 360 degrees of possibility here. But why don't you just go off in that sort of 40 degrees over there? Don't try everything. Just have a wander in that direction. Not the 1960s. And what they remembered was that those teachers were passionate about their subject to the point of eccentricity. They were crazy about terminal moraines and mad about iambic pentameters. The stuff mattered to them, and the eccentricity and the passion was incredibly important. So I think what you've seen online is the stars of online learning are already the people with passion. And I don't mean they're crazy, but just being crazy would be useless. But if you really know your stuff and you're passionate about it, then that all comes over, as does the knowledge. So, yeah, it's interesting times, I think.
Do you think that the way people learn online, will it, how you say 10 years later it'll come back into the classroom? Do you think that will happen in terms of, and I know David Price, who we've got on Friday, talks a lot about how students can learn through YouTube and they'll go on it at their own time. They can pause it, they can go away, they can come back. Do you think that those types of online learning styles will come back into the physical classroom?
Yeah, I mean, well, we know a lot more now about what's happening in your head, the cognitive processes. We can stick a kid in a functional MRI scanner, ask them to do some quite complicated mathematics, and we can see which bits of their brain light up, and we can ask them to, so we do know a lot more about it. We haven't applied very much of that. Or when we have applied, just applied one bit, let's do spaced learning, or, it's a very complicated thing, the whole picture. But the genie is out of the bottle for some bits, and I think connecting this is a really interesting one. I mean, Europe is anticipating something around the region of a third of its jobs being done online, and that was before this crisis, so you're probably looking at half now. If kids are going to be able to use their learning, they've got to be able to know how to work with others, and working with others in the same room was okay in the sort of 9-to-5 office, but you need to understand that there are people on longitudes and latitudes. The guys on longitude are having breakfast. Yeah. When you're having breakfast, folk watching this in South Africa, there will be some. They'll be having afternoon tea when we're having afternoon tea or whatever. But on the other hand, folk who are on the line of latitude, I finished my project late tonight. I pass it on to somebody maybe on the east coast of America. They pass it on to the west coast, out to Hawaii. They whiz it on to Japan, back through India and Eastern Europe and back home. And by the time I get up in the morning, I've got a team of 5 or 6 people who are working on my project. Well, working with them on the latitude is very different to working with people on the longitude. And if kids are going to understand that, then part of their classroom activity has got to be, as Andrea Sliker and the PISA folk at OECD now say, working collaboratively with others on problems. And so, kids are comfortable with, a lot of my schools have what we used to call a Skype bar, 3 or 4 computers at the back of the room. You walk over to them and you say, guys, I'm doing a survey on what did we have for breakfast, because I'm interested in what foods are good for my brain. Can I just ask you what you had? One screen's connected to Johannesburg, one screen's connected to New York, one screen's connected to Doha or whatever, and those are regular ports in the classroom. And I think schools that haven't got that ability for children to work with others are robbing their children of a potential career path, and I don't mean that learning ought to be entirely driven by careers, but if you can't apply the deep knowledge you're building to solve problems with others, I think that doesn't seem very fair to me.
No, and I love the stuff you're talking about there in terms of collaboration, and because our schools in the UK particularly aren't really set up for collaborative learning. I listened to something that you said on a video where you talked about the chairs in the room not being able to be moved, and there was a notice on the door that said that chairs can't be moved in this room, and the whole concept that we are working towards one student sitting one exam at the end of their tenure, and their grade is based on what they remember in that exam, and or whatever else that looks like. That's not conducive necessarily to effective collaboration or effective working together. You know?
Yeah, no, I know what you're saying, and you do need direct instruction. You do need to be able to talk to the whole class, but to build the classroom layout around that particular moment of learning, how am I now going to collaborate with 4 others? The chair facing in the wrong direction. I haven't got a table between me. How am I going to, so it's a little more complicated than it looks. But you know what? One of the things that makes me sad about the very traditional classroom is the lack of detail even there. I mean, let's imagine you did want to teach a classroom, the kids all sitting facing the same way, and you're chalking away from the front or whatever, which is, there's no wrongs here, there are just betters. We built these little learnometer boxes over the last 5 years. I've got a few lying around here. These were sort of little, originally the little 3D printed boxes with a whole mass of physical sensors on the inside. And we've been measuring, I've got one here actually, you can measure the CO2 in this room. You can see the CO2 is actually quite high in here, 1,600. So I'm just going to open the window a bit, and that'll go down. It's only me in the room, so I'm gassing myself with my own emissions. But I go into classrooms where the kids are all sat in a classroom, and it's a bit like being Dynamo the Magician. I can take a piece of paper, and I can mark up 2 or 3 crosses on the paper, turn it over. Teacher starts working with the class, or I do for that matter. And then a kid yawns, and I stop, turn over the bit of paper, and says the first kid to yawn is going to be sitting there. And I'm always right to within one desk. There's a circle that desk or the one adjacent to it will be the first kid to yawn, and the first kid to kick off and just become not necessarily naughty, but just disengage, and they start looking around and looking at their fingers or whatever, will be sitting over there in the corner, because over there in the corner, CO2 levels, we measure them up at 2,000-3,000 parts per million. The light levels are way too low. I'm sitting in here, bathed in light from a bright white LED light with a high Kelvin value, and just getting the light right in a room, it has a big impact on the way your brain works. And that's before we start on the temperature and a whole lot of other things, and it always makes me sad. People talk about, well, I'm going with the traditional classroom. Okay, but if you're going to do that, the least you might do is make it the best it can possibly be for the kids who are in it. One of the things we do is we get the kids to, this is not a trivia, don't worry. We get the kids to bring in a plant. This is an aloe vera. And this is Heppell.net/BYOP, bring your own plant. The plant does a great job in absorbing CO2 and producing oxygen, and we know what the best plants are, because NASA, dear old NASA, is heading for Mars, and when they go to Mars, they're all going to have a plant under their arm, getting on the spaceship, with a a money plant in this case. This is Monica. There she is. And the kids name their plants. And you know what's fascinating about this is it's so flipping complicated. So we started putting plants in the rooms because our little learnometers told us the CO2 was too high, and we put them into 162 classrooms. 162 classrooms. Put the boxes in Dubai, and they found significant changes in academic performance, in behaviour, in attention. ADHD dropped significantly. The kids they didn't have an attention deficit. The room was deficiencying their attention, if you see what I mean. They were quite hard to say to a kid who's been on Ritalin for 3 years, actually, mate, there's nothing wrong with you, you just need to go and sit by the window, So then it starts getting interesting because we say to the kids, you've got to put them in a white pot because the white pot reflects light. Obviously, the plant, simple photosynthesis, the plant's absorbing light. Light matters to the learning, so we make sure the pot reflects light back into the room. It's only a small effect, but of course the kids are then thinking about the science of the learning environment, and all that metacognition cuts in, and they're learning about learning, and the learning itself becomes a science. But also, here come the surprises. So one of the kids in Islington had an aloe vera plant. We gave him, it came from a pretty tough background. And I think it's fair to say he was pretty unimpressed. We're like, here you are, here's an aloe vera. You need to give it a name and look after it. And he's like, I'll call it Vera. But then he comes in every day and he sees it plant. He goes, aloe vera, and thinks it's very funny. Which actually, to be honest, it is very funny. But he's gone from being a 3 days a week attender to a 5 days a week attender because he's got something in the school. He's got skin in the game. He's got, people are talking about agency. Michael Fullan these days talks about agency a lot. Everybody talks about giving children agency, voice and vote. It turns out having a plant that you're responsible for and you've named, and they get all excited by spider plants and babies. Come and have a look. They get very excited about it. So we put the plants in to up the CO2 levels, but there's a whole social dimension to it as well, which we're still exploring. And of course, the kids that want to be a bit geeky can get a little Arduino, clip it on the side of the pot, measure the moisture levels in the soil, and build a self-watering device. And other kids are, trying different nutrients. Teachers are tipping coffee in theirs to see what happens. Some little blighter's probably weighing in his. They're all trying different things. To see how the plant behaves. So what starts off as being, let's just get one variable better, becomes a whole, massive good learning activity and good science.
So Stephen,
and that's true of all the other bits.
The learnometer, so it measures light, oxygen levels as well, did you say? Yeah,
it measures light. And by the way, we're interested in the lux level, the intensity of light.
Right.
You're trying to get above 500 lux, really, typically. But it also measures the quality of the light. So a lot of teachers watching this will be in a classroom with those hideous old fluorescent tubes. And the fluorescent tubes are bad in two ways. They produce a very yellow light, and you're trying to get a pure white light. Physicists will tell you there's a Kelvin value for a light bulb. When you go, next time you're in B&Q, have a look at the light bulbs and you'll see there's a Kelvin value. You're trying to get about 5,000 K with your light, which is a pure white light. So the old fluorescent tubes are very yellow, but also they have a flicker. They flicker through a color spectrum, but they also flicker. You don't perceive it. You're not sitting there going, do, 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 do. It's not like a bad cartoon. There is a flicker, but your brain sees it as movement and perceives it as danger. Right. So you're sitting there, and by the end of the week, you're absolutely knackered by Friday. I mean, teaching's a hard enough job anyway, but you're knackered by Friday because the blasted fluorescent tubes are scaring your brain. And some people watching this will be really old. Bob Harrison's probably watching. He's got to be older than me, surely. And he will remember when we used to put yellow bits of yellow on top of writing to help children who were a bit dyslexic, and there was a yellow transparency. But it turned out what the yellow transparency was doing was filtering out some of the color flicker. So once you get pure white light, and of course LED lights, not fluorescent tubes, once you get pure white, stable light, the kids who were struggling to read a lot better anyway, and you throw away the plastic, So this is all just complicated. So it measures the light. Sorry, long answer.
Right.
It measures the light. It measures the moisture levels in the air. The old ones used to measure air pressure, but you can't do anything about air pressure. So I thought it'd be depressing to put that in. It measures two sorts of pollution, and again, that's been really surprising because a lot of people thought pollution was to do with well-being, but it turns out really big Chinese research project. A lot of kids over typical China, nearly 10 years ago, didn't quite get a rush to get the results out, But something like 50,000 kids, and the average impact of being in a high pollution school, by which they meant next door to a dual carriageway. They didn't mean downstream of a industrial complex. The average impact of that was to make children at age 15 a year behind in their attainment to kids who were in cleaner air. So the entire class they dropped a year on average. That meant some of them didn't, some of them dropped 2 years. But the impact of pollution was huge. So we've been looking at pollution. And again, there's some lovely surprises in all that. So we're looking at chemical pollution, but also microparticulates. The chemical pollution we found in secondary schools, mixed secondary schools. We found there's a huge chemical spike towards the end of the morning. And we thought, cheapers, they can't all be flatulent. There's got to be something going on here. But it turned out it was boys spraying themselves with Lynx before they went out to break to meet their classmates and girls. And the girls, of course, had chosen to wash, which is a better solution, really. But the boys just kind of sprayed themselves with Lynx, and the graph was, the spike was off the graph. Then we found the most polluted room I'd ever been in a school was a head teacher's office, and she was as shocked as I was. And it turned out that her cleaners had really gone to town on cleaning the office and really cared for her, for her. And it was a chemical pollution from the cleaning materials. And we found a huge number of schools where they've had to rethink their cleaning regime because the residue of the clean, including stuff they were cleaning their whiteboards with, by the way, because the chemical residue in the atmosphere was damaging the cognitive performance of the kids. So, it measures a whole lot of stuff. Learnometer.net, you'll see the set of things there. But importantly, for everyone, there has to be a cheap remedy. So light, it's pretty cheap to put in LED bulbs, but we also paint the walls. And you can see the room I'm in here, actually. See the walls. See, the ceiling looks quite bright, doesn't it? I've painted that with a special paint called Space and Light. It's a Dulux paint. And it has a higher refraction rate. So what little light there is in the room bounces back off the walls. Whereas in the old days, people had painted school walls, Odin Neil, and I've been to the Nile. It was never that green. But they paint the walls with a sort of hideous green colour.
I don't need any more light reflecting on this, though. That's my problem.
No, you don't.
Stephen, can anyone just pick up one of these learnometers, or have they got to enter like a study project? Or
No, well, there's a good questions, really. First of all, with the first 100, people were part of a research project with us, and we had them all around the world. We had one in a teenage bedroom, by the way. And kids, schools and parents worry that kids don't complete their homework or struggle to concentrate. And yet when you actually measure the room they're in, which often in a middle class home is often upstairs, so the heat rises in the building. So the kids in the hottest part of the building, the parents have put a desk not looking out of the window because they think it might be distracting. So, the kids are teenagers, so they've probably got black posters. It's all big goth, and it's a catastrophic place to learn. If you bring them down into the kitchen or somewhere a bit more bright and airy, then turns out they can complete their homeworks a lot quicker, So, and we've had them in sports places all over, really. But now we've gone from the prototype to these these little boxes here, which are quite cute. They're marketed through Grapnels, the people who make all those plastic trays in every classroom in the world. But if you go to learnometer.net, there's a click through. You can buy one. We've got about 5 million hours of data now.
Wow.
I mean, there's stuff we don't know. I mean, I know that the light is really damaging to your performance. I know that the temperature, every degree over 18 to 21 is a sweet spot for learning. But every degree over 21, maths performance drops in a straight line. I'm not a vertical line, a straight line. So by the time you get to 23 degrees, your statistically significant decline in your maths is noticeable. It's about 1.8% of the standardized test paper, So if people are looking to get great scores on their GCSEs or their SATs or whatever, optimizing the room for performance is a very sensible thing to do. But I've been into 80, I don't know, I lost count now, 86, I think, exam rooms around the world. And I haven't been in one yet that wasn't damaging the kids in the room. And you couldn't improve, teachers watching this, you'll know how hard it is to get 1%, 2%, or 3% on everybody's paper. And yet it's sitting there in the room. You can give them 3% by decorating the place over the weekend, So I think what I'm saying, a long answer really, but a bit of a ramble, but even if people want to teach in very traditional ways, let's seize hold of the research we have, the new knowledge we have to make even those traditional classrooms a downside better. In Saudi Arabia, they stick black paper on the windows, and so all the kids are sitting in the dark. They've got some of the best light in the world, and the kids are all sitting in classrooms in the dark. Well, once you've got the data in front of you, the kids won't let you put the paper back up. They'll say, hang on, I need my brain on, not ticking over. I mean, it's interesting. This stuff has taken off into sport, of course, and to reverse the thing, and I got in. I'm a keen sailor, as it happens, and sailing's an Olympic sport, so you get a bit involved. I've been an international coach for the youth sailing teams and so on. So you find out very quickly that sailing's a downside easier than learning for an exam, because you just got to get across the finishing line first or be on the podium, whereas learning, to be good in an exam is a complicated thing. But what I did learn was all that Dave Brailsford thing about the aggregation of marginal gains. He says he didn't really believe the simplicity of it, but he says if you've got 15 things and you make them all 1% better, then your performance is going to be 15% better. Well, it's not that simple, of course, but if you focus on every damn thing, then you will absolutely get there. I mean, look, a silly example. So what we've been doing in Madrid with the kids in Madrid on the food, what's the food? Oh, I'm not trying to sell you a book. It's a free download. This is a PDF, and I'll send you the link to it afterwards. But we spent time doing a proper literature survey of what are the foods that you would want to eat to make you better at learning better on the exam room. And Ian, I'll answer that question about age in a moment. Thanks, mate. It's a good question. And one of the things we found, of course, was that there are some foods that are really good for your learning performance. To do well in an exam, you've got to be able to, recall stuff. You've got to be able to apply stuff. You need a degree of resilience because the exam could be a couple of hours. And you need a bit of optimism because, you want to, I can do this. So one of the ingredients we honed in on was very dark, high solids chocolate, because a square or two of that just kicks you into a slightly more optimistic place than you would have otherwise been. But isn't it interesting that 900 million kids a year doing exams around the world, and nobody's told them what to eat for breakfast? Well, every single middle distance runner I know knows what to eat for breakfast on the morning of their big event, on their heats, for 4 years. So I think what I'm saying is, regardless of where you're coming to this, in which pedagogy style you've adopted, let's, for God's sake, be the best at it we can be and give the kids a proper chance. Let me just go to Ian's question there, which is about age. And Ian, no is the answer, really. We haven't found that. Obviously, if you're working with early years, I've got a 4-year-old running past the window here now, their attention spans are different and so on. But, if the room is optimal, they learn better, is the short version. And we've applied this to company board. I go occasionally to a company boardroom because sometimes you need to earn a bit of money, to be able to do the free stuff, And they say, oh, we're despairing, everybody that joins the company leaves very quickly. The ones who stay don't have any good ideas, and nobody wants to come to meetings. And I say, show me your meeting room, And you go in, and it's some hideously dark, gloomy room with an oil painting of the chairman on the wall of the mahogany table. And he'd say, nobody could survive in this room for more than 10 minutes without slitting their wrists, So you can't make over the space. And suddenly people are full of great ideas. They all want to come to meetings, and the company survives, So, yeah, this works right across the board, absolutely right across the board.
Stephen,
to go to Olympic, sorry.
Yeah, I was going to go into the Olympic stuff in terms of the learning and how you've kind of transgressed the learning there. We saw a quote, we talked about it before we came on air in regards to how the GB team learned and managed and developed from a learning process from 1 gold medal to 27. And then I know that you've done some work with the rugby England team and all those. Maybe walk us through that process, because I'm sure people won't be aware of that.
No, I mean, it's an interesting bit of my life that, the different compartments don't always overlap, doing stuff in health as well, of course. So when we used to train people for the Olympics, we did it by number. And the coaches had often come out of the armed forces, and it was kind of if this, then that. And, you'll remember Brendan, God, I've forgotten his name now. You'll remember David Emery, sort of coming up to the start line. And he'd look around and he'd know exactly what to do. And who would the coach have been then? Probably the commentator would have been David Coleman or Stuart Story or something. And they'd tell you how that athlete was going to perform, because they did it the same every time. And yet on the day, a couple of sort of Kenyans would go whizzing off at 100 miles an hour, and they wouldn't know whether to go with them or whether they were pacemakers, and they were lost, and they'd always end up coming sort of fourth or whatever. So the trick, of course, is to prepare people for the unexpected. If your athletes go into the event as fit as they can be and as skilled as they can be, the things that separates them out is the ability to think on their feet. So people who watch rugby will remember the England rugby team going to play Italy. The Italian team coming out and going for what are called uncontested rucks, which is, instead of all getting down and bashing into each other's shoulders, they just kind of stood back. And the poor old England team, well, what do we do now? There's nobody to play with. And it was only when they went in at half time the coaches told them how to get past that challenge, that they won the match. So the trick here is to, on the one hand, get people learning more efficiently, because there's a lot more to learn. I remember Steve Backley, the javelin thrower, saying to me, he said, I just used to turn up and give my spear a mighty chuck. Like, I used to be a javelin thrower at school, so I was very sympathetic with it. But now, of course, you need to know about aerodynamics, material science. There's a whole lot of stuff about biotechnology, about recovery rates, ice baths. There's a mass more stuff to learn. And by the way, you've got to give your spear an even more mighty chuck. So the learning has to be really efficient, because there's more to learn in less time. So we take the England hockey team, for example, and I work with them with James Clark, who works with me at the learniture.co.uk company that makes school and learning furniture. And they showed us their room, which was a porter cabin, and it had bad light. It had a knackered old projector at one end. The chairs were all very upright. You could only sit on them in a very upright stance, which we know is bad, because the blood circulation doesn't get to your head. You need to try and hit about 120 degrees on your chair, not 90 degrees, because you have more oxygen in your brain. I mean, this is well documented, So they were sitting on upright chairs in a dark room with crap windows and a bad projector. Nobody ever wanted to go in there, and they were useless at set pieces. if you watch my local football team in Madrid, is Real Madrid Football Club, and you look at how bad they are in set pieces, you can imagine that their learning regime is not as good as it ought to be. So we took the hockey space and we put in tiered seating. So when you were doing that direct instruction, everybody was very close to you. So I know plenty of science teachers watching this, and you'll remember in the old days of science teaching, it would be bring their lab stool up to the front and sit right around the teacher, and the teacher would make sure you understood the bit about not drinking the sulfuric acid or whatever, and then you'd go back to your seat. And some of the more modern science labs that have been built are all rows. The kid in the far corner never does engage with what you're saying. They're just too flipping far away, So we put in tiered seating for the direct instruction. We use the floor as a teaching space. There are pitches marked out on the floor. The students pick things up and put them down. There's something about the physical act of picking something up and putting it down that hotwires it into your brain. If you fall asleep in a bed in a strange room, I won't speculate, but imagine you're in a hotel, you put your phone on the bedside table, and then you wake up, you reach out, your hand goes straight to your phone. There's a muscle memory that helps you to remember where it is. Well, that muscle memory helps build those taxonomies of understanding as well. So all the walls are writable. You can write on every surface. And again, we know that learning is often the cues and clues of memory are social things. The day you were doing something, you're writing something on the board, and a kid came in who'd never been late before, and you go, "Oh, Bob, you're late. Where have you been?" And he says, "Oh, my dog died. It's a disaster." Everybody remembers the work you were doing at that moment because Bob's dog died. It gave you little social cues and clues, semiotics, a little marker. When you write things on a board as a teacher or as a kid for other kids, you put a bit of expression into it. Teachers are all great storytellers. You circle around something, you underline it, and you say, "For goodness sake, this is the bit you really need to know." And yet when they copy it into their books, they don't copy the theatre of what you wrote. They just copy the notation. So when they come to look at it for revision, they can't even remember which lesson it was. Whereas when they've written on a wall, they take a picture of it with their tablet or their phone or whatever. Everybody's got some sort of digital camera to hand. When they look at the picture, they remember the moment because they remember the cues and clues of the writing. So back into the hockey room, all the walls are writable, the lights are super bright. Super bright. We're building classrooms to the same light level as BMW showrooms, I discovered the other day. I'm building them to 1,000 lux. The minimum's 500 lux. BMW showrooms are built to 1,000 lux. So you walk in and you go, "Wow, look at these cars." And kids walk into my classes, go, "Wow, look at this learning." It's the same thing.
On the stuff on the Olympics, I remember there was a big fad around. I don't want to say fad, I mean it in the nicest way, around marginal gains and around this idea that little tweaks, and you were talking about tweaks in diet, tweaks in lighting, tweaks in seating, tweaks in the windows, all the things like that. This sounds a little bit like there's an evolution and a revolution kind of thing. We talked about in a presentation recently the idea around the evolution of education is what's happened over time, but where we are now in terms of some of the forces of the pandemic and whatever else is forcing a revolution. Do you think it is a revolution or an evolution that we're at the moment?
Well, those are big words, and I'm always nervous to use them because they scare people a bit. But certainly what's happened is if you look around the country, you'll see some schools, I think, being really imaginative with how they're managing their online learning. They've got groups collaborating well. The kids are, there's a sort of people watching can think of a Venn diagram with three circles, and think of the sort of me, we, and see. And a lot of learning takes place in those three circles. The me bit is my sense of progress. Back to that iterative referencing we were talking about. The we bit is the work I'm doing with my classmates, with my project team, with my collaborator, with the guy on the desk next door. And the C bit is how I show it to everybody. And I think online people are very, very quickly realizing that the C bit is here's where I show my stuff. And I've got a bigger audience. So I put up remember my daughter, who also lives with me here, when she was a kid, she wrote an online thing. This was in the early days of the internet. The code came out in 1993. We had a website up by the end of 1993. Had to write our own browser. There were no browsers in. Wrote a browser. So that sense of audience. And I remember the things she wrote being picked up by a group in Canada, and they wrote to her and said, "Would you mind if we used your report in our newsletter?" And she was just so chuffed. So suddenly, as we go online, people have got a bigger role. There are people watching this in New Zealand, South Africa, South America, all over, and we've got a great audience for it, which in a traditional classroom we wouldn't have had. So the C thing is better when you've got an online component. The we thing is better when you've got an online component, because I can collaborate with other people in different places. What are you having for lunch? Oh, blimey, Well, I remember working with a bunch of kids in London, where the trick was to find 100 people where you live, where each person was the age of their number in the sequence. So there were a 4-year-old and a 5-year-old and a 95-year-old and a 96-year-old. And then they went on to try and do that with an online pairing with some schools in Africa. And the African schools couldn't find anybody over 70. And immediately they knew, hey, there's a difference between, West London and West Africa, and the difference is lifespan. So the ability to collaborate with others, that we bit is also better. The me bit is kind of interesting, because I think often the we bit online is less good than, I mercifully can't see any of your desks, but they're probably a mass of post-it notes and jumbles and all sorts of stuff, and most teachers' desks are flipping chaos, but it's quite hard to recreate the joy of chaos and the serendipity of discovery in an online space. So, maybe online the me bit is less good, but the we bit and the C bit is colossally better. And I think we learn from that as we go back into the physical classroom.
Can we move into like some of the projects that you've done? Because I think that's a nice segue into the emphasis you've just put on online learning. And I know that one of your projects held the world record for the largest internet learning project, and that was with Tesco. Could you maybe just get into a bit about that? And it'd be great if as we're going through some of these projects that you've done and which you're world renowned for, if we can keep bringing it back to the coronavirus, when schools reopen, what can we learn from these? Because I think to be able to take us through them.
So the Tesco project was fab, and I had a lovely team of folk around me doing it. Just good people. Bob and Carol at Intuitive Media down in Devon these days, and a whole gang of folk in Ultralab. I was running an Ultralab in those days, and we had this phone call from Tesco, and I think Tesco won't mind me saying that their first comment was, we've been giving computers away to schools. Do you remember the Tesco Computers for Schools scheme? And we've given away some huge number of computers, but we're not sure the schools are doing anything useful with them. We'd like to build a project that shows that they can. So we said, what a lovely brief. Of course we can, show kids doing something useful with technology. It's like, hallelujah. So we set up this lovely project, which again was a series of tasks. And sometimes they were tasks like find the oldest person where you live and ask them about their school days, or find the most famous person where you live and ask them about their school days. And by the way, the stories they discovered were scurrilous. I remember they were talking to a Hollywood starlet who happened to be living in the home counties, and the stories of her school days were basically, 7 years of kiss chase and getting drunk, really, the spectacular stuff. And the British newspapers never covered the stories because they thought, oh, only kids have done the stories, so they're not worth anything. People always undervalue children in all this.
Are you able to tell us who the Hollywood star was?
Yes, but not in front of 1,000 people. I haven't really been to watch. I don't end up in court. She's probably in denial now. But you know her very well. So a lot of fun, and one of the things we found, of course, was that we only had to set one task, and the 6-year-olds did the task and the 18-year-olds did the task. They did it differently at different levels. Sometimes they did it together. So we can see the mixed age and what I like to call stage, not age, work very well. you do it as hard as you do the toughest version of it that you think you're capable of, and that's when you get that pride in your own performance that's so motivating. We put a computer lab into every Tesco superstore in the training room. There was a funny moment when Tesco said, "Well, all our computer superstores are connected on the worldwide superhighway," whatever euphemism they had for it, And I said, "Oh, Grant, that's great," but it turned out all they had was a modem that uploaded things down the telephone line at 5 o'clock every night. So we had to put in a T1 line into every superstore. That cost £7 million on its own. So but of course, what Tesco learned from this all along was that kids are very adept at all this. Kids love to use the technology. We only had to set a challenge. Kids would work out how it worked, and if you look at a graph now of online sales, you'll find Morrison's, Waitrose down the bottom, and Tesco way up on their own at the top, because they started online shopping with a head start that they knew how kids could use technology. And I think across all the projects I've done over all the years, it's always been the corporate partners that got it, that went on to boom and make an awful lot of money out of it. And I'm pleased, I'm not saying that critically, it was good for them to support children because they learned from the children, and that was really important. And that project was fabulous, and we celebrated it in the Millennium Dome. And there was a point when every carrier bag you got in Tesco had the project on. Are your children taking part? A picture of Browser the cat on the bag, So they really went after it, and it was a huge project. But I'm not sure how many people are left in the Department of Education over there in Sanctuary Buildings who would even know the project existed. I'm not sure how many people would know that we had 23,000 head teachers all online with talking heads that went on to become the National College of School Leadership that Bob was talking about the other day. I'm not sure how many would know that we had, with Aviva, a project we did with Orange, the telcos, we had an assessment project where we challenged the kids. We said, "Okay, guys, you set your own learning outcomes. Here's a list of competency statements. Pick the ones you think you can achieve." We gave them all the competency statements from the whole school career. We thought, well, these are A-level ones. These are for 13-year-olds. You pick the ones you think you could have. Interestingly, every single kid picked harder targets for themselves that the school system picked for them. So they were always more ambitious, and even more interestingly, they always achieved the targets they set for themselves with the mutuality of their friends and peers. The best thing was, right at the end, your phone rang and it was a Viva. The project was called eViva, and your phone rang and it was voice recognition. We had AI running on the phone, whopping great supercomputer parked in New Zealand, doing all the processing. And the computer would say, "So, Stephen, the milestones you posted to evidence your third outcome, you've only really posted 2. Tell us a bit about that." And the kids would do a tough Viva, but like doing a PhD, and they'd answer the questions on the phone. Their peers would validate it and say, yeah, what he says is true. I can vouch for that. And their teachers would moderate it and sample it. And it worked fabulously, QCA project. But I don't know how many people in the Department of Education, if you went and said, they're all talking now about how do we do online learning? How do we do online assessment? You went in and said eViva, they wouldn't know. And the reason they wouldn't know was a lot of the records in sanctuary buildings were erased. Where are all those programs from Teachers TV was another project I was involved in, the really interesting thing about Teachers TV was that kids watched it in huge numbers. We had every holiday, we never had less than 250,000 children watching programs about how to teach maths better. And they'd sort of come in, the teachers didn't often watch it, the kids all teach, they'd sort of come in, "Sir, would you have a look at this program? Like, would you watch it before next week, please?"
Stephen, I want to go back into the Viva thing that you just talked about, the AI, and I think is that from 2002? Is that right?
Yeah, it was long distance, we're way ahead,
Yeah, and we're still trying to solve the problem of endpoint assessments and exams and all that kind of thing. but we're not looking at actually a resolution and a solution that we had 18 years ago. I was had to just second guess myself. Yeah, 18 years.
Good maths, Steve. And you worked at your maths.
I was like, it can't be 18 years. Or like 18 years is like 1980. But anyway, we've already got a solution. But
yes, we have.
It's been erased from their decades, but it has been erased from history. Surely somebody's got the data that we can push back to them and say, look, come on, this is here.
Yeah, well, I mean, if they wanted to read it, for sure. I mean, what was interesting about that was if you walked into the QCA in Piccadilly, the Qualifications and Curriculum Authority, I mean, the first leaflet they would give you as they came in the door with pride was a leaflet all about the project, which is still on my server, by the way. I mean, my server's got all this. I had 25 million people on my server last year. So there's a lot of people around the world looking at this stuff. They're just not always necessarily the Department of Education. There's lovely people in the Department of Education. I've got some great friends in there, people I'm warmly fond of, but they've lost the knowledge base of what learning research used to be. I mean, I'll take another silly example, but it's a nice one. I mean, when I started teaching, we had a thing called Mode 3 CSEs, and these were certificates of secondary education, and we wrote them ourselves. So in a school, you'd write the exam paper that fitted your community and what your community needs were, and you wrote it with other teachers, and people from other schools would come in. It was an ongoing process, and they would agree that you were doing it at the right level, and they'd moderate all the exam papers at the end, and it was all very bespoke, and it was fabulous, and I remember having to tell the parents in East London that we had to stop doing those Mode 3 exams, and I was teaching a thing called Black Studies then, which was look at Black culture, and of course we were looking at the protests on the Olympic podiums, and we were looking at the Montgomery bus boycott, and we were looking at music, and there's a whole lot of stuff that community is very much part of their Windrush experience, And I had to say that we can't do this anymore, guys. The government has decided everybody's got to do the same exam, and they looked astonished, and they said, well, you mean we've got to do the same exam as they do in Norwich? I mean, why they picked Norwich, I've no idea. For them, Norwich was somewhere very white and a long way away, And I said, yes. And they said, but there are no black people in Norwich. Well, of course there are, but from their point of view, why the hell would we have to do the same as somebody over there? But it's not relevant to what we're doing here. And all that stuff was lost, and we know that children can be a huge part of the process of marking exams. If you ask kids to do pair marking, you pick up two scripts and say this one's better than this one, this one's better than this one. Loads of good research evidence that says, a group of children looking at their own scripts and ranking them one-on-one will give you a better order than triple marking with professionals. So all this stuff is in the literature. It's well researched. It's there. They've just lost a lot of it, and I don't believe. I mean, I'm hugely optimistic. I mean, I don't believe this is ever the place where ministers or the department ought to be anyway. I think that schools and teachers and communities building from the bottom up, swapping quality research, quality evidence with each other, can do this better, and are doing it, obviously, with the virus lockdown. Some of them are doing it spectacularly well, and the others can learn from that.
I think that's really interesting. We've talked about this a few times about grassroots. We talked about it with Bob, actually, about the idea of whether it needs to be top down or whether it needs to be bottom up or whether it can be a bit of both. I think it's really interesting. In one of the comments that's just been put in, Jerry Owens has put the question, what's the next big step forward for learning and what is his biggest threat? Because I think that's entirely prevalent in what you're talking about, like the next steps and what that looks like. And then obviously there are some threats to that, aren't there? And I think that ties in nicely to that idea about evolution, revolution, whatever those words, whether we like.
Yeah, well, that's nice to hear. Nice to hear from Jerry, actually, who was inspirational in Kent during the Building School for the Future and some of those staggeringly good schools in Kent. I mean, we all came out of Jerry's hard work, really. So it's good to see him Hi, good to see you, mate. Good to see him online. But the question is complex because clearly there will be an attempt to just let's go back and carry on doing what we were doing, business as usual. But as I said, for some kids that won't happen because they won't even go back. They'll be sat at home with their parents learning in the house. So we will see some good virtual schools appearing, and I'm sure the department in their wisdom will be funding some beacon schools for online learning in the way they've tried to fund some beacon schools for technology. So there'll be a little bit of that happening for sure. I think the big changes, though, will be threefold. One will be lifelong learning. I think one of the things we notice when we put laptops and Chromebooks and things into the hands of some of our poorest families, and there's a whole inclusion debate here we haven't got into, but give me 2 minutes at the end and I've really got something important to say about all that. But when we put those into the families, we were worried about what would the impact of a little girl coming through the door, with a shiny Chromebook, and her mum has barely got literacy, certainly got no certificates. Are we forcing a wedge between two parts of a little family? What's happening? So we looked at it carefully. Phil Wilkinson looked at it as his PhD, and what we learned was when the kids put the Chromebooks down and went to bed, mum picked it up and said, "Oh, I'll have some of that." So putting learning into the house impacted on the parents, the community, the grandparents. Over in South Australia, we had reader leaders in one of the schools there. Reader leaders were grandparents who came into the school to help the children by listening to their reading. But before they could do that, we had to teach them about phonics. And because they knew about phonics, they were out in the community telling other parents and other grandparents about phonics. So lifelong learning is a big one. The artificial age barriers to learning, I think, have been doomed for some time. They don't work in orchestras, they don't work in families, they don't work in churches, they don't work in sport. You be as good as you want to be and you don't stop. People keep on playing golf when they're 99, for all I know. I don't know a golf player.
I think
the lifelong learning thing.
People are doing that anyway, aren't they, Stephen, in terms of that's how a lot of people need to survive today. We talk about that, the generation slashers, because people don't just have one career for the rest of their life now. They move on after a few years and have to upskill themselves, and they're having to do that anyway. So I think a more wider approach to that on a national level, maybe even an international level, would benefit so many people, and then that knock-on effect for business and innovation within business as well.
Well, no, surely, and you're exactly right, and then it gets interesting because then we've got the dimension of, well, hang on, now we've got the computers out and started looking at them again, and my first foray into all this in the 1980s was to drive around East Anglia with a lorry full of learning technology, and nobody had a clue what it was, and I was just saying, hey, look, this is what a laser cutter looks like, this is what a disk drive looks like. I remember I left it parked in a hotel in Ipswich overnight, and I forgot to shut the back. The back was wide open, and I came, about £20,000 of the kit in the back, and I came down in the morning, it was all still there. Nobody had stolen anything because they didn't know what it was, So there was a time when education was the place where you saw the best technology. The first time many people saw a 3D printer was in the school. The first time people saw a computer network was in a school. The first time people saw a computer screen projected onto a wall was in a school. And I think we've lost that in the last 10 years. The best technology is not in our schools anymore. It should be. And I think once people start learning with technology away from school, they want to take it back into school with them. But look, here's the challenge. What are computers good at? Well, they're good at rule-based systems. You teach them rules, it's called programming. They're good at remembering stuff. They don't forget. They're good at matching things. They're good at batch processing. They're good at being consistent. They're good at repetition. So if I've got kids in school who are learning to do repetition, to do batch processing, to be consistent, to do matching, there's sod all use because computers are going to do those things better. However, what are people good at? people are good at ingenuity, more ingenuity than creativity. They're good at collaborating. They're good at curiosity. They're good at deep understanding. Computers are not very good at deep understanding. They're getting better, but mainly they do rule-based systems. So, if we're going to complement the computers that are now so much an integral part of our lives, we've got to be good at the things that complement them. And I think you've seen with the coronavirus, here's Zoom or whatever people are using, and it's no sooner been up for a couple of days than people are passing a banana from one window to the next. And if you've seen that, you all have a banana on the desk, and you say, "Well, here's my banana." You pass it from one window to the next, and it looks as though the banana's going around the room. Heaps of fun. People are finding ingenious ways to make the turgid a little bit more enjoyable. Not that learning is necessarily about joy and laughter, but it helps to keep you on the screen. So if we're going to be good at the things that go with computers, we need to have a proper hard look at what it is we're teaching and learning in schools. And we need the deep understanding, but we need the adventure as well. And just going back briefly to the Olympic lot, one of the things we've been doing there very heavily is to face people with surprise. So the hockey squad, for example, and by the way, the hockey team, the girls won gold in Rio, so this stuff works, And we won't have the learning environment is only a tiny part of a really excellent coaching program. But the coaching program includes Thinking Thursday, where you turn up and they put the goals on the side of the pitch. So you're now playing for the morning on a very wide, very short pitch. Well, you've got to rethink the game completely at that point. So, when we come into school, one of the great things about the virus is it's made us say, hang on a minute, I wasn't expecting that. How can I cope? How can I still be a great physicist in this new environment? And that, how do I cope with the unexpected, is probably one of the most valuable things to come out of this whole crisis. And, you're not going to go back from there to a seating plan where Dan always sits next door to Ben, and you've sat there all year and you ran out of things to say to each other at Christmas, because what else is there, and if it's 11 o'clock on a Tuesday, you know what you're going to be doing on every Tuesday. So we've got to put the adventure and the excitement and the surprise back into learning so that people can apply their deep learning to those things. And that's a new world. That absolutely is a new world.
The title we give this podcast, like mentioned at the start, was A New Tomorrow. That new tomorrow could literally be within the next 4 weeks if some people within the cabinet in the UK get their way. How do we immediately begin to start putting some of this stuff in practice? How do schools immediately begin to take an advantage of what this new tomorrow could be?
Well, as always with these things, you look at what the successes have been, and you also look a bit at what the failures have been, although my preference is always to look at successes and move on from the losses. We learn from failure. We don't learn by learning people as failures. So, what's worked well, and talking to the kids is really good. I was talking to my 10-year-old 11-year-old, 12-year-old granddaughter down in Dorset. Emily, God, she's going to be a teenager next year. She's full of good ideas about how to work with her friends and, problems to solve in TikTok or wherever. Kids are full of, interesting strategies, and we need to learn from them. And, most of my life has been presenting children with a challenge and watching them overcome the challenge and learning from it. So I say a lot in the media, I'll say it one more time here, that if you surprise children with what you ask of them, they'll always astonish you right back with how they deal with that and how they cope with it. So number one thing when the kids are back is, what have we learned from the online experience? What's been good? What are the things you wouldn't have had before? Ask the kids, and then share it with each other. And you haven't got to go to a blinking PD session to share it. What is it they say? Three people talking is a conversation. Two people talking is a dialogue. One person talking is a monologue. One people talking with nobody listening is professional development. So we haven't got to go back to that. We can swap ideas online. We can use strategies like you guys are doing right here, of saying, here's a few folk with good ideas, let's record them and share them around the world. So, let's learn from what's learned and what's worked, and let's not wait for ministers. Often when I do professional development, and to my shame I do occasionally, I often open with a slide of all our past education ministers. And don't tell Jim this, because there's about 20 or so of them, and I say to people, name them. And nobody can remember most of them. Nobody knows their Gillian Shepherds from their Mark Carlyles or their Stephen Byerses, or they have not got Ruth Kelly. I forget the names as well, They pick out a few. They know Charlie Clark because he was larger than life, and they know, I think they often know Jim because he was all over technology. And of course, they all know Estelle because she was a PE teacher. But by and large, they can't even remember who the ministers were. But most people will remember the colleagues they've taught with in the staff room for their whole career. So you know where to go for, wisdom and insight. And I sail an old boat. I mean, I can't sail it at the moment, so I'm busy for revarnishing all the blocks. It's going to have the shiniest blocks it's ever had in its life. The boat was built in 1907, and when we started sailing this thing, I got some pretty good sailors on the team with me, and we were absolute rubbish. And people were going past us, like smoking a pipe and eating sandwiches in a smock. We're there in our kind of lycra, and we thought, God, how are these guys going so fast? So we talked to them. Of course, they were full of, you don't want to do it like that, or you want to try this. They were full of good advice. Teaching is the same. There's craft and there's technology, and the craft doesn't change. If you're in a school and a kid has a car crash, or it's a windy day, or you've just had a crisis, the school is a different place, and you learn to cope with that organically different place, and you move on. So the craft is there, but over here is the technology, and the technology is bringing us things that we never dreamt of before. And I don't just mean the Internet of Things analysis of the classroom. I mean the ability to really look at what learning looks like. So back to your assessment question, we assess kids with an exam paper. Why? Because Oxford University didn't have enough people to do vivas. So they said, well, we haven't got enough people to listen to what you've learned. Would you mind writing it down? And here we are still writing it down. But hey, we've got the technology for people to say it now, and to listen, and to post it, and to blog it. And so, the assessment system, I think, is no longer fit for purpose, hasn't been probably for 30 years, and will need to change. Bob, when he was on, had an analogy about horse manure. Well, I'll add my analogy, which I always use, which is you learn to be a car driver. And in the early years of motoring, I drive a 1931 car, so you kind of learn to drive your car, and you get to be pretty good at it. You turn up for your driving lesson, and there's a blinking horse standing there, and you say, well, how am I going to ride the horse? And they say, don't use the horse. We've always used the horse, So you're sitting on the horse trying to change gear with his ears and do hand signals, and you fall off the damn thing, I mean, that's where we are with all this, don't use the horse. We've always used exam papers.
I love that line. Don't use start. We've always used the horse.
and also, let's change gears with the ears. You're a poet and you don't even know it, Stephen.
Why are all the analogies about horses?
I mean, my 1931 Austin 7 has two levers on the steering column that change. One changes the advance or retard of the spark on the engine. So I'm driving along, retiming the car as I drive along. An entirely useless skill, but cars have moved on a bit, and I think we've just got to look at. But I would say we haven't got to invent this from the ground up. We've got loads of good experience about what assessment can look like. But as we move into it, let's imagine we're trying to assess people on their ability to work with others. Now, we ran Not School for 10 years. NotSchool.net was a virtual project where we took children, 1,000 kids a year roughly, who'd been excluded from school, mostly by behaviour, sometimes by circumstances, but they'd been kicked out. And you don't get kicked out without things being pretty bleak, And one of the things we were interested in is the extent to which they would start to see themselves as part of a team or with others. And of course, that's really easy to do because you just parse the stuff they're writing. You look for pronouns, and you look for kids to talk about we and us and ours rather than me and mine, and you can see in the writing that stuff. Now, if you had to mark that by hand, that would be hard work, but a computer will spit these things out. Whenever a government white paper comes out in education, I always feed it into Wordle because it's always revealing to see which words they're talking about, and it's almost never kids. I remember Tony Blair publishing an education paper where he only mentioned kids 3 times, and then as adjectives, the pupil performance, the pupil performance or the pupil. He never actually mentioned the kids at all. He was horrified when I told him, So we've got the tools to analyze learning and to analyze speech. And by the way, to look at where their eyes are focusing and to look at, if my Apple Watch is telling me how fast the oxygen's getting to my head, why wouldn't I want to know that as a teacher? Quick, children, get up, move around the room. Your bodies have all slowed down. You're becoming stupid. Our ability to look at successful learning is coming from technology in all sorts of interesting ways, and that's quite exciting.
Yeah, I think obviously before we wrap, there's a couple of questions. I think Dan, there's one from Neelam. I don't know if you can see that, Stephen, is a quite a poignant one.
Yeah, well, good to see you, Neelam. That's like family of friends out there. It's lovely, so many. But Neelam wrote one of the best PhDs I saw in a decade, so she's utterly fab. But there are always gainsayers. There are always people who can stand up and say it's never going to happen, or I've seen children with tablets and no learning is happening. Well, you can say the same about pencils. I've got here's a pencil. I've seen kids stabbing each other with their pencil, so we should take pencils away from them. Well, we know that when you give kids something to do with the technology that they couldn't do otherwise, that's when you see them really, really cooking with gas. We just have to ignore the gainsayers. But it jolly well helps if we label them as such. If we say, well, I hear what you're saying, but you're just a gainsayer, and what we're interested in here is what we learn going forwards. Whereas at the moment, I blame the BBC for a lot of this. I mean, I remember going on a Newsnight program with Jeremy Paxman. And by the way, guys, there were 28 technicians in the studio for that live broadcast on Newsnight. So you're each doing the work of 9 here, and I was on there to talk about the impact of technology on children's, ability to use the knowledge they were building and to work with others. But that was in the days when I think we'd had the very first time we had children connected to scientists around the world. The scientist was in a volcano in Hawaii, and the kid's first question, just text-based, they said, where are you? He said, I'm in the volcano. I can see the lava. It's very exciting. The next question was, how fast can lava go? And he said, and the third question was, how fast can you run, mate? So immediately their insight was like, I'm in the volcano with that person, and when I was on the Newsnight thing to say, this is cracking stuff, this is really good, the person who was in there to oppose me, who turned out was a political activist from a political party that I was not a part of. He was there to say, oh, computers are a bad thing. Shakespeare never had a computer, blah, 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 and just a load of nonsense. So, we will be at a point when a load of teachers and a load of schools can see this stuff really works. And there'll always be some clown who says it doesn't. Well, we just move on past them and value them. It's nice sometimes to have people who don't believe in technology, who think, I was taught not to use. Look, I'm still this sad person. Look, I still use a fountain pen. Look, there it is. Because when I was at school, I was taught that a ballpoint pen, was a dangerous and inappropriate tool. So, look, you see, you scurrilous anarchists, you brandishing your bigs at me, in a dangerous and unlikely kind of way, probably stabbing each other as soon as the camera's off. But I don't mind. It's nice to have people who say, you know what, I like to read a bit of Latin, or I like to work without technology. It's not about that. It is about equity. And maybe I want to say one serious thing at the end, really. Not that all this hasn't been serious, but, I'm lucky enough to work around the world in all sorts of places. In the last year, I've been down to Yemen, we're talking about what we can do about kids out in Pakistan with no schools and no teachers. UCJC, my university in Spain, we've taken on refugees, given them free places on degree courses, and talked to them about what it's like when somebody drops a bomb on your lecture room and you're the only kid who makes it out alive from the lecture room. So kids around the world are having a tough time with learning, and we're all saying, oh gosh, we've got to do online learning, and it's hard to learn to cope with Zoom, and streakers keep appearing in my Zoom window. What am I going to do? Nobody's bombed our schools. There'll be no barrel bombs to the roof. By and large, nobody's raping our teachers. Nobody's shooting our grandmothers. We're very lucky here in the wealthy West. And what do we do with that? Well, there's 2.2 billion children in the world, and about half of them are having a pretty torrid time with learning. About half of those have got sod all learning at all. And for many of them, they're never going to have Western schools, the beautiful schools that Jerry was building in Kent. They won't even have buildings that look like the bike sheds. And even if they did, 25 million kids in Pakistan with no teachers, where are we going to train 1 million teachers or pay for them? It's not going to happen. So what we do with our wealth and our opportunity and our technology and our bandwidth, and what we do with that is we try to go first and go early. And of course, it costs a little bit of money to prototype. Of course, it's a little harder to build an asynchronous mixed age teaching environment for children, but we are duty bound. There's a moral imperative here for us to discover how good this can be going forward, so that the many kids who are never going to be able to ape Western schools with all their wealth and stability will have an education that is jaw-droppingly good. And my belief is we can get them off running down a road that's a new road, that's traditional family learning craft, traditional communities, high technology. We can get them running down that road. They haven't got to preserve their legacy systems. They can go straight around those legacy systems and show us how good it can be. And if you look at Kenya at the moment, Kenya, really interestingly, they had a research project about putting 4G internet connection up on balloons. And it's pretty good. Google, I think, sponsored it. The minute the coronavirus thing hit, they said, take that experiment, make it nationwide. We need bandwidth. And they're rolling out across the whole country now. I think it's called Loon.
Project Loon.
Project Loon, that's it. Project Loon. So it's across the whole country. And they took the decision because they saw that they needed it, because they were disadvantaged, because they didn't have the advantages we have in the wealthy West. So what we need to do is to show how good this can be. And anybody who thinks they can go back to school and do it like it was before is letting down those children immeasurably. And I think we have a moral imperative to not do that. We're going to solve the big problems on the planet, which will include more. And this is COVID, whatever number. We can have COVID 42 before we all retire. And behind that we've got climate crisis rolling, and behind that we've probably got fighting in the streets after Brexit or whatever. We're going to face crisis after crisis after crisis, and the world needs every kid. There are kids sitting around in Pakistan. There are grandmothers sitting around in Pakistan who had no education at all because they were women. Well, we need them. We need every single man, woman, child, and granny in all this. So lifelong learning has to be part of it. Connected learning, collaborative learning, learning using the best possible science to make children's learning their personal best. Just like if learning was the Olympics, that's our duty to do the best we possibly can. And everybody watching this, I want you to promise me you're going to go away and you're going to do something that frightens you with its braveness coming out of this, because I promise you it won't frighten the kids. They'll say, oh, thank God, a decent challenge at last. And then they'll show you how good they can be. So there's a serious point here, which is we're flipping lucky and we ought to do something with it.
100%. I think as we wrap up, Stephen, I think the keynotes there, the takeaways are go first and go early, teach like it's an Olympic sport. And I think I think they're massive things. And I think be brave, be bold.
And enjoy it. I mean, I've taught for long enough, and I spend a lot of my time still in classrooms. I've been in 30 odd schools in Australia over the month before I came back. Teaching is the best years of your life. I mean, sometimes the worst days, let's be honest, you get the odd just horrendous day, but it's the best years of your life. And I'm going into this next decade so excited, because the things that I've seen work, the things we've proved, the things we've invested in, the things we've researched are all now ingredients on the table for people to pick up. And I'm confident some of them are going to pick up some of those things, and there ain't no turning back at that point.
Well, thank you so much for coming on, Professor Stephen Heppell. It's been an absolute pleasure to spend an hour and a half with you. An absolute genius, and some really fantastic words at the end there that will resonate with so much. Thanks for listening, everybody, in terms of the worldwide audience that we've had. Don't forget, we've got Lord Gym Night on tomorrow at 6:30, and we've got David Price, OBE, on at 2 p.m. on Friday. Tune in live. And once again, thank you very much, Professor Stephen Heppell.
Yeah, Jim, let me just say, Jim's not just Lord Knight, he's Baron Knight.
Baron,
and some of you will
right.
be old enough to remember the Baron Knights, and you should play a bit for him. He's a fabulous bloke. He's good.
We're not going to have enough characters on Twitter to be able to tweet them.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Yeah, thanks for what you're doing, guys. Thanks.
Stephen, if you stay, what we'll do is we'll end the broadcast, but if you stay on, then we're going to have a quick chat. All right, cheers. Thank you.